3, where we're looking at the industry as a whole. We're going way back to this time, passing by everything we've done, all the way back to 1896.
This is 896, that's even earlier.
With the yellow kid. Not that yellow kid, the other yellow kid.
What about Donald Duck one? Yellow Donald Duck, I was waiting for that.
No. No Donald Duck. No, this is the Yellow Kid from 1896. This is generally considered the first comic strip. There's technical reasons for that. And it started out as a comic done by a guy named R.F. Outcalt. And it was just making fun of a certain borough in New York with goofy kids running around and doing stuff, including this one who's yellow and has his thoughts written out on his cloak. So when this started, it became very popular very quickly, and it was running in the New York Globe, I believe. And the New York Journal said, "Hey, come over here and do that. We'll pay you 3 times as much," because it was actually making a difference in how many papers they were selling. And so he moved over there, and the New York World hired a guy named George Lux to continue doing the Yellow Kid strip. And the R.F. Outcalt said, "Hey, that's my character," and they said, "Hey, that's our strip." And so the Journal and the Globe were both sort of tabloids. They were mostly there interested in the money, and they were making up silly headlines and stuff themselves. And so why were they doing it? Why were they here? They were doing it because they were making money. What happened with the Yellow Kid was that it was so popular that everybody else started making comic strips too. And within a few years, nobody even remembered the Yellow Kid, so it didn't matter. But there were lawsuits immediately because about who owns it. And even though this was mostly an argument about who's going to make the money from it, it was also the first time that comics had the question of whose voice gets heard, which didn't really matter here, but it becomes very important later on. With Superman, endless lawsuits. I'm just going to skip through some of this so we can get through the whole thing. Jumping ahead to the 1950s with EC, and then we're on to our third trope, which is the war stories. These were different from any war stories that anybody else was telling. What they were, Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine, also ran their war comics division. And their war comics were not the kind of exciting tales that Captain America was doing, or anything like that. These were comics of record. It was not unusual for Kurtzman to hand a 6-page comic script to an artist, along with 80 pages of research. And if you had a guy in the background holding a gun that wasn't issued for another month, you had to go back and start over. And that was what he cared about, was that you got the absolute truth of what happened. And the special issue on Iwo Jima, is a really good example of that. Most of their stories were 4 independent stories. This was 4 interconnected stories. And the first story was just the geologic and eventually political history of the island and why everything about that mattered. So anyway, that was what they were doing. Another story of a comic of record that came about the same time was this, written by one of the guys that marched right alongside MLK in Montgomery. And Al Capp, who did Little Abner, his studio produced this for free. Basically, it tells the story of MLK's life, the issues around what was going on in Montgomery, and then a section on how to run a peaceful protest, all the techniques to use. And it got distributed mostly through the churches down in the South, and got translated pretty quickly to Spanish and distributed through Central America in countries where they had similar issues going on. We're going to skip that, and somebody else who knew how to deal with an icon. Gloria Steinem, when she was putting together Ms. Magazine, she wanted to put somebody who really deserved to be there on the cover of the first issue. And finally she decided, well, we should do Wonder Woman, the great defendant of love, truth, and compassion. Not realizing what had happened to her in the intervening time since she'd been a kid reading Wonder Woman. So what happened just in the past few years before she did this, sales had slipped across the board for comics, but for some reason the editors decided that Wonder Woman had slipped for a different reason than the other comics. It had slipped because young women just couldn't identify with her because she had all these powers, and women don't have powers. So they finally decide, okay, this is what we're going to do to make the female readership come back. And they decide they're going to let her marry Steve. In order to do that, she first has to go through a whole thing where she gives away all of her powers because she needs to be subservient to him in the marriage, of course. And that's not inferred, that's straight out stated. Yeah, so she marries Steve, who is immediately murdered. She meets this kung fu guru guy who teaches her how to fight, because she can't remember how to fight. That was so long ago. And so she starts learning how to, shoot down planes with her machine guns, and by the way, she also runs a boutique. You want to make sure the women can get what's going on. So the only reason that we have the Wonder Woman we have today is Gloria Steinem wouldn't let them live it down. So back to the Undergrounds briefly. Underground's hub was the San Francisco area in 60s, 70s, and Harvey Milk era, and the comics kept they're part of the counterculture. these undergrounds. And they start changing the laws, mostly around obscenity, so that they can prosecute them and get the comics off the shelves. And eventually they got to the point where they didn't just change the laws, they gave the power to enforce them to the Vice Squad. And Harvey Milk era Vice Squad. And so, once they did that, I mean, it was just a matter of a couple years, and all but 15% of underground publishers were gone. But they were, burning down their shops. They were, sticking people. They could walk into a store and say, "That's obscene. That's obscene." Just anybody from the Vice Squad could do that. And then, "That's obscene, and you're the person who happens to be behind the register today, so you're going to jail." So an assortment of independent comic creators got together and wrote up a Bill of Rights. And it's much longer than this, but it's, basically things like you own what you create. This was not something that had any real direct effect in any way, but it was kind of a sign of things to come. Comic culture was changing. The first comic conventions were starting to pop up. And the big thing that happened with those was that the fans of comics started following the creators rather than the characters. And so it gave them the power. And the conventions were great. They, you'd get to meet your favorite artists, and they would give you feedback on your own work. That was a typical thing. So a couple of guys who worked at Marvel, actually there were 3 of them, but not this one. They were talking amongst themselves about, a different way to do things, because they were still dealing with, still making the same page rate and that kind of thing. And these guys had gotten a little beyond that in the industry, but they still were trying to figure out how to make it all work. And so they figured out their plan after about a year of talking about it. And the 3 of them flew into New York and met up with a couple others, and then just by accident ran into a couple others on the street, comic creators that they knew, and told them what they were doing. And the next day, 7 of them, they had 7 of them, and these 7 creators were responsible for the top 25 of the top 30 comics that were selling in the country at the time. That's how influential these 7 guys were. And they walked over to the Marvel offices, because up till this time, the way if you wanted to work in comics, you would go over to the Marvel offices and you'd work there for a little while until you got fed up, and you'd leave and you'd cross the street to DC, and you work there till you got fed up, and you go back across the street. And that was pretty much, what you could do. What they decided to do was, the 7 of them walked into Marvel and said, when we finish this issue, the issues we're working on right now, we're done. And then they marched across the street to DC, and DC saw them coming and went, "Oh, hey, come on in." And they got the top guys from DC and the lawyers and the contract writers and all of them, and they walked in and said, I don't think you know why we're here. We're here just to let you know that we're not working for you anymore either. And they started a company called Image Comics, because what they had figured out was this guy here was he was working on the top comic at the time, as well as a few others. And they were paying him $1 million, $1.5 million per issue. And he figured out that if he went off and did his own thing, if he just sold 10% of what Marvel sold, he would still be getting paid more. Which really makes you think about the $150 page rate. So they created their own company where they just basically took the business model and flipped it on its head. And they cover all their hard costs and administrative costs. That all happens first. And anything beyond that, the creator gets. Coming back around to the question of what comic did Kirby sell? What was the individual issue that he made the most money on in his entire life? This is it, Phantom Force. Nobody's ever heard of it, it's terrible. This was, Image had started just like a year before he died. And so this was them saying, hey, come do something for us, Jack. And he just like grabbed a bunch of stuff that never went anywhere, and little scribbles and designs and stuff. And there was something he was trying to do with the Bruce Lee family, never went anywhere. And they took all of those bits and pieces and klooged them together and kind of made something out of it. It was awful. And it made him more money than any other comic.
Schlock.
We were talking about the comics culture and the conventions and people that you liked that you could give them, they'd be willing to give you feedback on your work and that kind of thing. This is one of them. But he decided at a certain point that he wanted to do something different, and nobody ever paid for this or charged for this. But he decided if he was going to talk to you, he wanted you to sign something first. So what was that, and why did he want you to sign it? We're going to go back again and look at when comics have stepped outside of the page. Back to 1940. And this is when Captain America came out. Captain America wasn't Captain America wasn't just an exciting story. It was like most comics at the time during the war. It was there to rouse the troops. It was there to get people involved. It was there to dehumanize the enemy, so it made your job a little easier. It was there to sell war bonds. They had all kinds of things with, buy the most war bonds and you get enough, and we'll buy you some more, that kind of thing. It was all about keeping Uncle Sam in the war. Jumping ahead now to 1949, um, after after keeping everybody involved in the war, and we're now protecting the homeland. Superman radio program was still hugely popular, even though most of the comics were going away. But one day they had the FBI walk into their offices and say, "We have a story we want you to tell." And it was a story about the KKK, but they couldn't say the KKK. It was the story of the Clan of the Fiery Cross. And it's about this young kid who kind of learns about the KKK because it turns out his dad is part of it. And Clark Kent, the reporter, is learning all about how they function and all of that kind of thing. But the reason the FBI wanted them to do this is they had an informant in the KKK, up in the top tiers, and he was giving them information on how they operated as an organization, and it was part of how the FBI eventually took them down. I mean, part of what they got him on was just tax stuff. But there was all of this information on how they did things that was being infused into the storylines and told through that. But it was stuff where if you weren't part of the KKK, you're like, hey, a rousing story. If you were part of the KKK, you were like, how did they know? Who do I trust now? And it was actually did make a huge difference. They had some top tier KKK members who turned state's evidence as a result of this. So, just an interesting way to use Superman. So in 1953, there was a child psychologist who had written a book saying comics are the cause of juvenile delinquency, and he became very popular, and comics were in a lot of trouble because of all the bad press, and this went all the way up to Congress to decide. And just to give you a sense of the time period, the first day that they held a hearing for comics was the day before the first what's his name?
Oh,
McCarthy.
yeah.
McCarthy, yeah. It was the day before the first McCarthy hearing. And so it went all the way up to Congress, and remember our friend Max Gaines? He has since died, and his son took over. Max, when he was actually running EC Comics, that was his company, and he was doing Bible stories. When Bill Gaines, his son, took over after he died, the EC Comics that you've been seeing, that was all Bill. And he became the poster boy for the congressional hearings. And here's and the horror comics were what was really driving it more than anything else. but here's the cover of
Mm.
all of the newspapers. This was the
Mm.
this was the image. One of the senators asked Bill. He said, "This is in terrible taste. How could this possibly be in worse taste?" And Bill said, "Well, for a horror comic, I think it is good taste." He said, "How could it possibly be worse than this?" He said, "Well, if I wanted it in bad taste, I'd have him raise the head a few more inches." Which is a good, valid point, but not what you want to be noted for in the press. The Congress came back and said, comics are free speech, same as any other medium. But the press had been so bad that comics couldn't sell themselves anymore. And so a bunch of the publishers got together themselves and created a company that checked comics, that would look at your comics, and if you follow the guidelines for doing a moral comic that's good for kids, then you would get a little stamp that says, "This is your kids can read this." And if you didn't follow those guidelines, you didn't get the stamp, and the distributor wouldn't buy your comics, because the way comics were sold, it just got sold outright each step along the way. And the distributors, who couldn't care less about comics, what the content of what they were selling didn't really matter to them. They were just the vehicle. But they knew if they got at the other end and there wasn't a bunch of stamps on those comics, the next person online isn't going to buy them. So there were comic burnings and things like that. Boy Scouts would buy out all the comics on the shelves and then burn them. Just kind of a little aside here on this one. This was the first underground comic con, and there were basically a bunch of hippies put this all together. Right? They were invested in it because they were invested in it. But when they got to printing, they used the best printer they knew. And he was a guy who didn't believe in any of this stuff. But, as it turned out, he felt it was his duty as a printer and as a citizen to help other voices be heard, which is just not something you hear much these days. So, changing mores. So this is, I'm going to try and make this one as short as I can, but this is the guy that wanted you to sign something. He's in independent comics, he's a genius. He's done all kinds of things to find new ways to tell stories using this medium. He is also a huge proponent of free speech. He also helped create the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund for anybody, anywhere on the line from consumer to publisher has any legal problems. And he also wanted you to sign something. His name is Dave Sim. He wanted you to sign something that said, "I do not believe Dave Sim is a misogynist." He had Cerebus the Aardvark was his big magnum opus. He spent 30 years and 300 issues telling that story. And it's a satire of Conan the Barbarian. And about 2/3 of the way through, he started writing essays in the back of his comic, and the essays kept getting bigger and bigger, and the comics got smaller and smaller. And basically, most of his essays were about women's place in society. And as best I understand it, it was, he believes that women are voids who are there to suck out men's souls. And that is not metaphor. He means that literally. He does admit to some drug issues. He does admit to some mental health issues. But that's his activist choice. And for two reasons I wanted to mention him. One is to remind you that activism comes from all sides. But second, because with asking you to sign something like that, and this is back in the 90s, and this is a fine distinction, but misogynist meant literally person who hates women, as opposed to the broader definition that it has now. He basically, said that those intelligent, fascinating, complex female characters that he had in the first half of Conan or Cerebus, those were the joke. And the bubble-headed women that he was doing now, those were the reality. And what he was doing with asking you to sign that piece of paper is something that politicians do all the time. They tell you a story and they frame it before they tell it to you. And when they become well enough known, they don't have to frame it. Just knowing who they are frames it. And this is all stuff. There have been a bunch of studies on how we respond to stories and how they function in our brain. If you are so, if you were telling a story about an average black family going through their daily, just daily events. And that story is told by Martin Luther King. You have a sense of what that story is going to be like. It's going to be about respect and dedication, positive things. But you give that same story, you can give it word for word to David Duke, the Grand Wizard, and it's going to have a bunch of other connotations without him even changing a word of it, because you know who he is. And you can change that with a word. The way our brains work, when someone is telling a story, the parts of the brain that are lighting up for the teller are the same parts of the brain lighting up for the listener. It doesn't matter if you agree or not with what they're saying. The structure is their structure that they have determined for you. If that makes sense, if you're following.
Yep.
So anyway, that's what Dave Sim isn't dumb, but he's got some issues that are different from most. Back to the MLK comic. It also got translated into Portuguese, and then more recently Farsi and Arabic, and distributed during Arab Spring, and it's actually been cited in several places as helping to keep that Arab Spring as with as little violence as possible. Our friend Nate Powell, we've been talking about, and the story of March, John Lewis. These are some of his other his other graphic novels that are all about different issues. He's a native Arkansan. I think he lives in Indiana now, but but he thinks of his comics as his way of maintaining a discussion with the Deep South. The book of his that I find the most powerful for me is called Save It for Later, and it's his memoir about being both an activist and a parent. And I see this story as completing that MLK comic that was written 60 years earlier. Because this one says, okay, if you're going to insert yourself into this world, here are the things you need to be aware of. Here are the things you need to know to keep your family safe. Here are the things you need to do to bring the next generation along behind you. The core of this book was something he did for an online magazine that was just examining the trappings of neo-Nazis. And here is what happened with it.
About a month later, they published a response to About Face from someone who was a veteran. It was not a cartoonish counterpoint. It was complex. It did show where a couple of my points I could have clarified a little better. It was nice because it's like, it pushed back against some of the things I was saying, and it acknowledged some of the things I was saying. Instead of whether or not my work pushed or transformed or made someone else uncomfortable, it was the fact that someone articulated themselves well enough that it actually made me uncomfortable. I could have done a better job, but we managed to write back and forth a little bit, and it arrived in this very healthy place. You can see where they exist in dynamic tension with each other. People want things to be so dichotomous now, so binary. This is for this, and this is against this. And neither one of those pieces in relation to each other makes a binary. And that's what makes it so great.
There's another artist who, David Mack, who for the last 15 or so years off and on has been working for the State Department. And what he's been doing is going into foreign countries where there are at-risk youth who are at risk of becoming indoctrinated by terrorists. What he does is he teaches these kids how to express their own stories through the medium of comics. You don't even have to be able to read it. You can do it without any language. But the more you are able to get someone to say, this is my story, the harder it becomes for someone else to come to them and say, no, this is your story. At one point he was even in a consulate teaching, and it got taken over by armed militants. And he spent the next 2 months trying to get medical supplies and the release of the people, the administrators who had been there but hadn't gotten out. I'm just going to skip through a couple of things here. Image finally had the first union in comics, but it's the administrators. They're the ones on the end. Our friend Howard the Duck, Steve Gerber, got invited by Marvel to do one short story of Spider-Man and Howard the Duck. And he did that story and ended it with Spider-Man and Howard in a warehouse that's filled with a bunch of copies of Howard. And at the same time he did that, he did an Image comic where Destroyer Duck met up with one of the Image characters, and they ended up in the same warehouse with another duck called Leonard, who was basically Howard but green and a complete idiot. And they repainted them. If you looked really close in the background, they repainted them and swapped them. So Howard the Duck, even though Steve Gerber never got the rights back to him, he now lives in in Steve Gerber world. In 2016, Wonder Woman was declared, let me make sure I get this right, the honorary global ambassador for the empowerment of women and girls at the UN. And lasted less than 2 months. By that time, they had over 40,000 signatures saying this is not an appropriate person to use for women and girls. Jack and Roz, just before Jack died, got won one of their final trials where they were lawsuits where they were trying to get all of the original art that the Marvel Comics had kept, all of the decades of work. They just kept the artwork, and they won the lawsuit. And then they went to pick it up at the Marvel storage area, and 70% of it was gone. It had been given away or stolen or whatever over the years. And this is the last thing I have. This is Bill Willingham, who did a comic called Fables. And this Fables has been one of the most important mainstay comics of this century. It started, I think it started in 2000, year 2000, and until just a couple years ago, it ran consistently, always at the top of the of what everybody chose for the important, good books out there. Fables is basically fairy tale characters living in our world, and it's his take on that. The one thing that he did when he signed up with DC at the beginning of it was that he made sure he got the intellectual property rights, which means the concept and how it is told belongs to him. He wrote, about a year ago, he wrote an open letter and just sent it out to the world, talking about how when he first started doing this, he was dealing with people who were honest and understood, what was going on with him and what rights he had and what rights they had and all of that. And since then, DC has been sold and resold to all kinds of different people. And every time he has to renegotiate, and every time he deals with people who have less integrity, to the point where he no longer can do anything with the fact that he owns the intellectual property. Because every time he brings it up, they say, oh no, that doesn't apply here. And so he finally wrote this open letter saying, okay, what I'm gonna do is the only thing left for me to do, because I have no rights, according to these people, to anything with this being my intellectual property. So from now on, I declare it public domain. And anybody in the world who wants to do a fable story can do their take on it. They can use whatever parts of anything he had done on it they want to use. It's open to fair game to anybody in the world except him, because he is still stuck with a contract with DC. So he's the only person in the world who can't tell his story. And that's it. That's all I got.
Thank you, Jeff. I know we're running a little late. We can probably do a couple of questions if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
The internet is changing the dynamics of publishing.
Yes.
Go ahead and say something about that.
Yeah, there's a whole industry there that is not in any way connected with the comics that I've talked about today. And it's still, it's still being explored. I know someone who is one of the top selling comic creators in the world, literally the world, right now, who lives in Albuquerque. And unless you are a fan of a very specific type of story, you've never heard of him. Because he won a contest to do the beginning of a story from a company in Korea, and he's been doing it now for I think 15 years, and it is volumes and volumes. It's like this probably stacks up that thick as a print thing, but unless you know a very specific thing about Korean comics, even though he's probably in the top 10 or 20 people in comics in the world right now.
I have a question that I don't mean to be snarky at all, but as a young man, I remember comic books from two different occasions. One is in the U.S. military. In basic training, every week we would get a comic saying, okay, this is the end of your first week and you're gonna survive, to encourage you, okay? And you should have guys crawling under the wire and whatever. And then also religious tracts that were comics, okay? And they were laying all over the Midwest where I grew up, and talking about how to get you saved and what's gonna happen if you don't believe the way the artist does. Were these geared toward people that didn't read very much? I don't mean that smart aleck, but literacy problems.
Yeah, I think they did try to keep them, so it was the same thing as with David Mack working with the kids who were at risk of being indoctrinated by terrorists. It's the lowest common denominator kind of thing, because you're trying to convince, to sway everyone. And you're also trying with the military comics, you're also trying to entertain them. And a lot of the people I've talked about are some of the artists and writers that did those comics that you're talking about.
Thank you.